Oh, so today is Sunday, and I wanted to tell you a story. A story about when I was a child being raised Mormon. I'm no longer Mormon, and I have not been in the Mormon church for probably 20 years, almost. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my childhood, and I'll tell you all of the story eventually, but what I want to say is I had a great childhood, except for the sexual abuse that happened when I was a child. That wasn't great. And I think that there are a lot of people in religion that are sexually abused. But that's not the reason for this video today. This video today is just to tell you about my Mormon childhood. And how great it was. I grew up in a very small town in Idaho, and grew up on the Snake River, if you know anything about Idaho. Grew up on the Snake River, and my life was really, really good. I could wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my parents had 8 children, so I could, pretty much choose one of my sisters to get up early in the morning at 5 o'clock, and we'd get the full boat, which is like an 18-foot kayak, and race out across that river with double oars. That river was like glass. And grew up swimming and floating down the river and living pretty much in the water in the summers. Couldn't live in the water in the winter because it was frozen. But I just wanted to tell you about my Mormon childhood, how we were the kind of family that, and I hope I'm not shaking here, because I do shake a little bit. Ugh. Let me pull this a little closer, see if I can control that. But my Mormon childhood was beautiful. And my mom and dad did not smoke or drink or do drugs or drink coffee, drink tea. We weren't allowed to have caffeinated soda, so I didn't drink caffeinated soda. We were only allowed to drink soda that didn't have caffeine in it. But I still had such a beautiful childhood, and I will say that the Mormon community that I grew up in were really good people. Really, really good people. Salt of the earth people. Good people that would help you, help each other. And I love that, because we were a tight community, and I think very service oriented, which I think is something important in life. I think it's important to serve other people and be kind to other people, and I think Mormon people are kind, and I think that for the most part they're genuine. And so grew up Mormon, and I would say my family is generational Mormon. So my grandparents were also Mormon, except on my father's side, my grandpa on my dad's dad was not Mormon. And he was a whiskey drinking, poker playing, and I'm sorry, but I think he was a bad man because of the things that he did. But my dad's mother was a generational Mormon. So my mom's side of the family, very, very Mormon. And Mormon all the way back, in the sense that my great-great-great-grandparents, actually on both sides, my father and my mother, practiced polygamy. Polygamy meaning more than one wife. As a girl growing up, as a child, female, I could never understand a God that hated women that much, that he would not only command that women allow their husbands to have sex with other women and take more than one wife, but also claim that that was going to be practiced in heaven in order for you to reach the highest degree of glory in heaven. So not only on earth, but in heaven. You know, that teaching alone is a psychological trauma. And in my opinion, I think a lot of Mormon women have psychological issues, whether they recognize it or not. I still believe, when I look around at Mormon women, that there's some issues there that have not been addressed. I think that that's my opinion. It's my viewpoint and my story. But what I want to say was, as a child growing up, I was very carefree and very, my parents took care of us really well. My parents were both hard-working parents, and like a lot of Mormons were, I think, hard-working people and productive people. And my dad, you know, every year would plant 2 huge gardens. We lived on a small farm. We had our own everything. We didn't have to go to the grocery store. My mother was a home economics major, so she taught candy making and sewing classes, and she would sew most of our clothes. And my mother was a quilt maker, and she loved to crochet and knit, and she would make everyone in our families, you know, for every event, my mother would make something for weddings, for baby blessings, for graduations, college graduations, high school graduations. Every baby that was born, my mother made them a baby blanket, a knitted baby blanket. And my mother was a perfectionist, so she made things perfectly. It was a big deal to be perfect. But that's a big deal in the Mormon religion, is to be perfect and to try to do everything that you do perfectly. Now, none of us are perfect, but it definitely is a Mormon goal to strive for perfection. But anyway, I wanted to tell you sorry, the wind is blowing. I'm outside and I'm shaking a little bit here. Sorry that I'm shaking. I don't have a tripod, so I'm holding this with my hands. But I remember as a young child, now the Mormon Church always did general conference every 6 months. So every Easter, which would have been April, and every October, the first weekend would be general conference. And general conference meant that we didn't have to go to regular church. We could actually stay home. Now, we didn't have general conference available on TV, so we would listen to it on the radio. And I remember when I was in like 1970, I believe it was 1978, 79, I was laying on the floor because I loved general conference. I loved laying on the floor in the living room and listening to the leaders of the church give their talks. I loved the feeling of being spiritually filled and inspired. And as a young girl, I remember, because you would listen to the leaders of the church, especially the prophet, and you would want to obey because obedience was the number one lesson taught since the day you were born. that you need to obey. And I remember laying on the living room floor listening to General Conference, and the prophet at the time was giving his talk, and I remember him saying specifically that there was a book out that they did not want the members of the church reading. And it was written by a woman named Fawn Brody. And the title of the book was No Man Knows My History. And so they did not want the members of the church reading this book. And they specifically stated it in General Conference that year, that they did not want the members of the church reading that book because it would lead them astray. And I remember as a young girl, because I was raised to be very obedient, and so I remember thinking obediently, I will never read that book. I will never read that book, and I will obey. I will obey the prophet, and I will do what he says. And so then if you jump forward to when I was about 38 years old, I had many questions about my religion from a young age, because I would watch my mother worry about polygamy. And even though my father was a convert to the church, in a sense, his mother was a Mormon, but my father, was not raised staunch Mormon. My mother would tell my father, if the church ever reinstates polygamy, I'm the first wife, and I get to choose the second wife, and I get to choose the third wife, and on and on. But I remember distinctly as a young girl watching my mother really worry and fret about this idea that someday the Mormon church might reinstate polygamy, and someday my mother might be forced to live that. Sorry, I'm shaking a little bit here, but forced to live that here on this earth. Because my mother would often say that to my father in front of me as a young girl, I remember the anger and kind of the despair that I felt that God hated women. Why did God hate women? Why did he hate them so much that he would order them, command them to live this disgusting, unhappy situation with polygamy? I could never understand that, and it caused an incredible fear deep inside my soul, and a fear that sometimes I would, even as a young teenage girl, I would cry, like literally cry tears of sadness and despair, shake my fist at God. Why did he hate women? Why did he hate women? All right, I have to pick up where I left off. But anyway, I didn't understand a God that hated women and only loved men and only cared about men. And I would see this even manifest itself in the Mormon church as I grew up, where boys were favored over girls. It seemed like they were first when it came to the sport program in the church, and they were first to be able to do these different kinds of adventure trips, is what I would call them. I remember feeling, even as a young girl, that boys were more important than girls. And I think as I view the world, I'm now 57, that I do even see that in our society, where boys have been favored over girls in many different situations. once again, that's my opinion, and that is the lens that I have seen the world through. And I believe that it's true because it is what I see. But anyway, back to my story. I didn't get a hold of that book, No Man Knows My History, until I was probably 38 years old. And at that time, I now lived in California. And California was my door to freedom, in the sense that I no longer was surrounded by just Mormons, because Idaho and Utah is very Mormon. And it's kind of like living in an echo chamber where everyone agrees with each other and everyone repeats the same lingo, the same verbiage, the same, what I call sometimes Mormon myths. And in California, I felt like for the first time, I guess for the first time I felt like, sorry, I'm shaking a little bit there. I felt for the first time that I could actually speak and maybe have my voice heard. And I moved into a neighborhood, and I thought, I've never been allowed as a child to have non-Mormon friends. I was only allowed to have Mormon friends. I remember one time, there might have been a couple of times that my mom let me go to a non-Mormon kid's birthday party. But my mother was always very afraid of that influence on the outside. So very rarely would you ever be allowed as a child in my world to be around non-Mormons. So when I grew up and I moved to this house in California, I thought I could go meet all of my neighbors, my women neighbors, and kind of pick their brains, because by that time I had now left the Mormon church. And I wanted to hear, because I still had this incredible fear about polygamy and being forced to live that in heaven. So I decided I was going to have a party at my house, and I was going to invite all of the neighbors that were not Mormon to my house. And I was going to pick their brain kind of about these ideas that I had been raised with. I wanted to hear what a non-Mormon woman would say about these ideas that I had been raised with. And the first neighbor I met, she was very liberal, from Southern California. And when I ran by her, what did she think about polygamy? And what did she think about that being practiced in heaven? She laughed and told me that was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard of in her life. And I remember feeling like this breath of fresh air, that maybe I didn't have to live my life with these deep-seated fears that I had for so long. And that there were maybe lots of women who did not believe like Mormon women, and that I should surround myself with them so that I could hear a different viewpoint. And that's what I did. But back to, back to that book that we were told not to read. When I was about 38 and I had moved to, this house that I live in now, and I surrounded myself with non-Mormon women, I decided that it was time to, quit running and approach the monster that I had been scared of for so long. And I knew that the only way I could do that was to get my hands on as many books about Mormon polygamy, written by not only Mormon authors, because we were only allowed to read Mormon authors and listen to Mormon leaders, but to get my hands on books that were written also by non-Mormons, because you cannot change the facts of history. If you're a historian, the facts are going to be the same, whether you're Mormon or non-Mormon. And I knew that whatever I read that was historical would have to be based on court documents, journal entries, facts, factual things, because every historian would have to write those facts. Now, I noticed that Mormon historians skew it and in favor of the Mormon Church, and so, you know, you can twist words and you can make them sound sugary sweet all you want, but you can't change history. You can't change documents in, like, court documents. You cannot change actual events that happen. You just can't change those. And no matter how you sugarcoat them or justify them or make, you know, your religion or your people the victim, because that was definitely a narrative I was taught my whole life, that Mormons were always the victims. My mother was a staunch Mormon, and it wasn't just my mother, it was the whole church that promoted this narrative that the Mormon people were victims. Everywhere they were chased out of, everywhere they were persecuted, they were the victims. But that's just not historically what I discovered. So I got my hands on every book I could, non-Mormon and Mormon, about Mormon polygamy, because I decided I was going to quit running from this horrific fear that I had as a female. And I began to read because, you know, as even young members of the Mormon Church, we were taught that knowledge is power. And never in my wildest dreams did I think that I would ever leave the Mormon Church, ever stand outside the Mormon Church, because I too was a staunch Mormon. I went on a mission. I, you know, graduated from seminary. I was baptized, I was blessed. I was given everything that a normal Mormon is given from the day that they are born. And so I got my hands on that book that I was told not to read when I was 9 or 10. No Man Knows My History. And I'm not gonna lie. Let me set this here for just a second. I'm not gonna lie that that is the book that made me leave the Mormon Church. Because Fawn Brody, the author of that book, actually was the niece of one of the leaders of the Mormon Church. So she actually was a member, or had to have been a member. She was a historian in Southern California. And she was a really good historian. And she gathered all the facts about Joseph Smith and who he was. And once I read everything I could get my hands on, my religion shattered at my feet. And it was devastating. Such a deep devastation. I mean, I had gone on a mission. I had knocked on doors. I had taught people this. And members of the church believe in education, but they do not believe, and it's not their fault. It's because the leaders of the church have told them not to study or read anything that the leaders of the church don't put out. So it's not the members' fault. They're taught to obey, and they're taught only to listen to the leaders of the church. And it's very ironic that Mormons have this deep belief in being educated, but they are not educated about their history, and they refuse to educate themselves about their own history because they're told not to do that, and they're told to obey. And so they do. They obey. But standing outside, oh, there goes the birdhouse. But standing outside the Mormon church today, that's a big red flag, isn't it? When a religion tells their members, don't read anything that we don't put out. That means they're hiding something from you. There's something they don't want you to know. And the truth is, if every Mormon read the history of their religion, not written by only Mormons, but written by non-Mormons as well, excuse me, I actually believe that Mormons would leave en masse from their religion because they have been lied to and they have been deceived. And I'm not going to lie about my experience within the Mormon church. I loved my experience in the Mormon church. I love my childhood and I love my college years, and there's a really secure environment there where you feel so cozy and comfy, and everybody's friends and everybody, understands each other, and everybody's doing the same things. And I think that the fact that, I still have never drank alcohol, and I'm 57 years old, and I'm glad I never have. I'm glad I've never smoked. I do drink a little latte now, and I've always thought that tea was appropriate if you were sick for like medicinal purposes, or even, a warm drink. I'm not a big tea drinker, but never done drugs. And I think that when you're raised that way, it stops a lot of chaos in your life. You don't have those vices. And when your parents don't do that either, you're raised in a really nice environment. Just free of all of that garbage that, those addictions you don't have to put up with, which I actually really appreciate, and am so grateful that I was raised that way. And I raised my kids that way. My husband and I don't drink. We've never had alcohol in our house, and we don't smoke, and we don't even still have a coffee maker in our house, because the truth is we're kind of ignorant to all of that. We really wouldn't know what to do. So anyway, back to what I was saying about reading that book, No Man Knows My History. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would stand outside the Mormon church. But by 2003, I kind of had started studying in 2000, and by 2003, I had to make a decision. And I kind of compare it to having a court of law in my mind, where I was the judge. And in that court, in my mind, the evidence had been presented. And the choice was, I could either live a lie or I could choose a different route. I had come to a crossroads, and I had to choose. Do I keep plodding down this path straight ahead? Do I lie and pretend? Do I pretend to my family? Do I pretend that I'm still a good Mormon? Do I hide it? Or do I turn left or right and take another path? And see, this is the dilemma. The Mormon Church also, from a young age, they don't only teach you obedience. They teach you to be honest in your dealings with your fellow men, your fellow man. They emphasize not being a liar, being honest. And I think the most disturbing thing was I discovered that my leaders had lied, even though as members of the church, we had been taught since the day we were born to be honest in our dealings with our fellow man. And the leaders of the church had been lying to us all the time. That was really hard to grapple with. And that was how I made my decision. The Mormon Church had taught me to be too honest. And so the answer was that I could not live a lie. I had to make a choice to take a different path. And so I did. And here I am. It's 2026. And I've been out of the Mormon Church since 2003. And that's the first part of my story. I'll tell you more later.